Okay. Hopefully everybody's batteries got a little recharged with the extra time. Me, I'm more tired than when we started, but that's okay. That's okay. A couple of things today I think will be beneficial for us to work through quickly, and then we'll handle our business here. I have a couple of announcements at the end. What I want to talk about right now, though, is something we started last time. It's going to be this period of sectionalism leading up to the war. Now, really, where we are is we're starting to consider a kind of before and after picture of the U.S. and its history, before and after picture of the Civil War, essentially. Now, in one of the crash course U.S. histories, when they're talking about the Civil War, he makes the point, which is a good one, that there are 8,000 battles in the Civil War. So obviously we don't have the time to talk about them. And actually I'm not an expert in military history. So that's not even my strength. But even if it was, we wouldn't have the time to kind of go through 8,000 battles. Even if we study this, this is why the Civil War is one of the biggest sections in Barnes & Noble, right? That in World War II is a lot of different angles, a lot of information. What we need, though, for our purposes is to think about how we get to this conflict, that it's still the bloodiest war in American history. Right? How do we get there? How do we get to the point where Americans are going to be killing other Americans only about 80 years after the nation is founded? Right? And then, of course, what comes out of that, right? Who wins? Why do they win? And then how are they going to try to put the pieces of the puzzle back together again? Because if you think about it, what we have is, in our last couple of discussions, we've talked about the construction of this nation, its early development, and now we're at the point where it destroys itself. Right? For 4 years, Americans are going to kill each other in what is still the bloodiest war in American history, right? Bloodier than all other wars combined. So this is obviously a significant tipping point. And in addition to the killing, the destruction itself, many argue that this war makes us modern, right? It makes us a modern nation. So we also want to see how and why that's the case. Right? What is it that we become and are still becoming? Right? A lot of our current challenges, some argue, go back to this particular period, and maybe some things are still unresolved. Some historians call the Civil War the Second American Revolution, because they argue that it tried to resolve some of the things that had not been resolved yet. Right? Try to resolve some of the things that had not been resolved yet in the revolution itself. But then others argue that there's still going to be some unresolved issues. Right? So Reconstruction, which is the period immediately after the Civil War that we will discuss, and I'll give you an outline for and everything, is also going to try to continue this process of rebuilding the nation, of making it modern, of putting the pieces back together after it all seems to fall apart. So based on all you've already done, right, you've done a lot in terms of building the foundation. We spent a lot of time with the overall concepts so that now we can actually look at some critical moments in becoming modern, right? We can now move a little more quickly and jump around a little bit and try to get a sense of the bigger picture here, which is what we have to do anyway, but we actually, I think, can do it more effectively now based on what you already have under your belt. Excuse me. So what I'm going to do quickly is actually, again, give you a kind of before and after snapshot using the Civil War as kind of the pivot point. Right? The Civil War is going to be the sort of pivot point for us. How do we get to the point where these Americans that have just become Americans kill each other, right? That they go from forming one nation to forming two, and then going to war. And then how do they put the pieces of the puzzle back together again? This quickly, of course, gets us into the late 19th, early 20th century, which takes us to then studying World War I. World War I takes us directly into the Great Depression. The Great Depression doesn't end until World War II, right? And World War II ends with the Cold War, which then dominates the rest of the century. So in many ways, things speed up historically for us. Right? I told you, you've done a lot of the hard work already, I would argue. And I think you've done the hardest work already. But we still have some things to do. Right? We still have some things to do. Now, of course, this also lets us have some more conversations. Right? This also lets us begin to tie past and present together in some specific ways. So our last couple of assignments and meetings and such have been designed to kind of pull some of that out. Think about this notion of the native mascots, for instance, or think about what you saw in the Ethnic Notions video and how all this ties in, yes, to this particular period before the war, or the antebellum period as it's often called. The term antebellum is a Latin term. If you speak a Latin-based language, you may already know what that term means just by looking at it. Right? Ante, before, bellum, war, so before the war. In this case, they're referring to the Civil War. So the period before the Civil War, maybe 30 years or so before the Civil War, is the period that we're looking at. So what happens in this sort of 30-year period before the Civil War breaks out in 1861, and then what happens after that is going to tell us a lot of the rest of our story, you can argue. Does that make sense? Okay, so I'll go through kind of quickly. In addition, I think that you can be a little less concerned with some of the details here because of the way that we're going to address this. Right, we're going to cover the period immediately before and after the Civil War. I'm going to give you a detailed handout on Reconstruction, and then we're going to look at the rise of industry, the rise of cities, how we become modern. So you don't necessarily need to worry about, say, a multiple choice test about the Civil War or anything like that. We're going to jump forward. We're going to skip around a bit, and I'll say more about that as we move forward, just so to try to limit some of the anxiety and some of the stress. So a couple of topics that I want to mention briefly. Christian Paul may join LeBron. This antebellum period, of course, is going to raise some big picture issues, many of which we've already started to discuss. All right, this question of expansion, this question of growth, especially the West and moving west, is going to be something that both the North and the South are occupied with. They're concerned with. They both want to dominate this move west, and this is going to lead them into conflict. And of course, a lot of that conflict has to do with the institution of slavery. Right? Is slavery going to be allowed to expand into the West? Right? This is something that's being sort of worked out between the various powers that be in the North and the South. So we're continuing to grow as a nation, but we're also growing apart. Right? This term sectionalism is designed to raise that issue that we're almost moving into separate sections. Yes, we've always been different regions, but sectionalism is kind of different. Right? Sectionalism is really the tension that develops between these regions that are really starting to see themselves as separate, as distinct, as two separate imagined communities. So maybe even before the shooting starts, the shooting may have already started, right? We may already be on civil war, not be on the road to civil war and not even know it yet. Well, how does that happen? Well, again, a lot of it's going to have to do with the question of slavery and expansion. Now, we talked about the Revolutionary era, how many were arguing that slavery was over, right? Slavery was out of style. Maybe slavery could be ended, some would argue, in the period of the Revolution for at least two reasons. First reason we discussed was that it seemed hypocritical to talk about all men are created equal and yet hold slaves. Many do take that seriously, and many decide, you know what, we got to do something different. There's a whole other group of folks that would argue that slavery was not economically profitable anymore. Right? It wasn't economically worth it to enslave other people, to risk getting your own throat cut by a slave that was upset and might revolt for what might not be the biggest amount of money. Right? Especially when folks start to plant cotton. Some will argue that it's not profitable. Right? It's not profitable by the 1790s, right? To use slave labor to pick cotton. Think about cotton. Now, I've never picked cotton, so this is all theoretical. But imagine putting your hands in these sort of tiny bowls and getting out the little cotton, right? Putting it in a basket, right? And you're like, wow, okay, that was hard work, right? Maybe getting stuck by a little pricker or something. I'm thinking like rose bushes with cotton on it, right? So you're, oh my God, got this little cotton. And they're like, yeah, okay, that's great. Now give me 100 more pounds. You're like, wait, this doesn't weigh anything, right? That's a lot of work. Yeah, it is. I'll see you tonight, right? So imagine how that possibly might not be profitable. But something's going to happen to change all that, right? There's going to be a particular tipping point in 1793, and that tipping point is the invention of the cotton gin. Right, the cotton gin is invented in 1793, and many will argue that it changes the game. Right? One historian called it the most important invention in American history. Why? Well, because it's going to literally make what may not have been as profitable suddenly extremely profitable. The cotton gin in 1793 allows you to clean 50 pounds of cotton per day instead of 1 pound per day. Right. So now you can clean 50 times as much. That's a lottery ticket. Right. Suddenly, as they had earlier with tobacco, folks are going to throw themselves into cotton production with both feet. Right. The U.S. will be the producer of cotton for the entire planet. By the time the Civil War comes, we're producing 75% of the cotton in the world. Right. It's coming from the South. So this causes things to tip. Just at that moment where some were like, you know what, we can take it or leave it with the whole slavery thing. Suddenly, oh no, we're not leaving it. Right? In fact, it needs to grow. Right? We can't let it get contained to the South, as some of those northern abolitionists are arguing. Some argue we got to move west. Some argue that we should annex Cuba and make it a slave colony. So all of a sudden, everything changes economically, politically, socially. And again, you saw some of this reflected in the Ethnic Notions video, which may have just seemed like you were watching cartoons. It may have just seemed like you were sort of seeing social stereotypes. But think about the political significance of those stereotypes, which is part of the questions that you are to be concerned with. So how does this change things? Well, by 1811, Georgia and South Carolina are producing 60 million pounds of cotton a year. 60 million pounds a year, most of it shipped to England, which is going to help supply England's own industrial revolution. Right? It's going to help fuel those textile mills. Not just in the U.S., but this is going to be a world-changing event, you can argue. Tipping point worldwide. At the same time, though, cotton has some of the same downfalls as tobacco. Right? Remember those 3 problems? One of them being soil exhaustion. Cotton does the same sort of thing. So what are you going to need? More land, expansion. Those people that are in the way are going to have to get up out the way. Right? Who's in the way? Mexico, Britain, Native Americans, right? As we've been discussing. So they're going to have to be, those obstacles will have to be removed. We're going to see tremendous growth and expansion. For example, between 1810 and 1820, the populations of Mississippi doubles, right? More than doubles. The population of Alabama grows 16-fold in a 10-year period. People are moving south. They're moving south and west, right? And they're looking for new cotton lands. Nearly half of all white South Carolinians born after 1800 eventually left South Carolina, usually moving west. So you're getting this kind of flow of people, and the nation itself is growing as the population grows. Now, again, think about this. If you're moving and you want to find more opportunities, especially for this cotton land in places like Texas, you're going to have to ensure that that remains a viable option, right? That slavery itself is a viable option. So for these abolitionists talking about we're not going to let slavery expand, that feels to you like an abridgment of your freedom. Freedom is one of these subjective kind of things, right? What does it mean? What am I free to do? Am I free to enslave someone? Does that even make sense linguistically? So I think these questions are being put forth, and we're going to have some trouble answering them. Right? We're going to have some trouble answering them. Does the freedom mean moving Native peoples out of what might be their traditional homelands because it's opening up this opportunity for others? So think about how these issues continue. At the same time, the institution of slavery itself is going to go through some changes. So I want to say just a few things. This is a huge topic. There are whole classes just on antebellum slavery, but we obviously don't have the time for that. But just a couple of quick sort of points here. Another key tipping point is 1808, January 1st, 1808. Remember back when we were talking about the Constitution, we said that one of those compromises that comes out of this, one of those very divisive issues was the slave trade itself. Remember, they're like, let's get rid of the slave trade. South Carolina and some other states are like, look, if you do that, we're not signing the document. Okay, we won't talk about it for 20 years. But what do they do in 20 years? They bring it up again, and the Atlantic slave trade is abolished. It goes into effect January 1st, 1808. Now, that does not mean that slavery ends. That means that it becomes illegal to bring in more slaves from outside the U.S. And again, there may have been various reasons for that. Some argue we don't need to bring in more. Why? We can reproduce this population from within. Right? We can reproduce the population from within. How are slaves going to be? how are the numbers of slaves going to be increased if they're not allowed to get more ships and go kidnap folks and bring them in? How is that going to happen? What do we know about that process? Say that again? Children. You can produce more slave children, you can produce more slaves. Well, how does that happen? What do we talk about in terms of the laws of slavery? All the way back to the 1600s.
If the mother is a slave, the child will be a slave.
Exactly. So you can do it through the wombs of these women. Slavery in the U.S. is called a peculiar institution, and it's some consider it peculiar in part because it's the only slave society. This is the only slave society where, quote unquote, slaves naturally reproduce themselves. I'm putting naturally in quotes, but they naturally. What does that mean generally? Without having to bring in millions of slaves, because we never bring in millions. We actually only bring in about 600,000 total, about 10 times less than Brazil, for instance. But this society, in part because the gender ratio is more equal, in part because of the way the laws were set up, in part because of things like rape and breeding. That's why I say the natural has to be in quotes, because a lot of it wasn't natural. But part of it was people choosing to have children, right? If you're a slave, maybe one of the few things you can control is your family. At least you might think so. Of course, family can be sold away. But some women will choose to have children. At least I can have something to care for, something that's beautiful in my life, right? To remind me that I'm not a piece of property. So many will choose to have children. Right? We go from 700,000 slaves in 1790 to 4 million slaves by 1860, with another 500,000 free blacks by 1860. So the population will increase. But again, it's only partially natural. Right? It's only partially natural. And I want to talk a bit about that idea because it seems contradictory. Yes, some people will choose to have families, but some of it's going to be coercive reproduction. There's something called slave breeding, right? The breeding of slaves. They essentially look at them like animals, and they say, okay, let's have them breed. So owners, for example, say, man, I got this real big strapping guy, and I got this lady, she's real healthy. I think she'd be good at childbearing. Let's put them together. Right? I don't think they like it. I'm not concerned about whether they like each other. Right? Let's put them together. Look, if you two don't give me a child in a year, I'm going to whip you. I'm going to sell you. That's coercion, right? There's a story of a lady named Rose Williams in Texas where she's told she got to get with this guy named Rufus. Right? Rufus is a big strapping guy. Rose is a big healthy lady. Let's put them together. That was the only calculation that went into it. It's an economic decision. If I put them together, they have 10 children. They may have just given me $20,000. So let's put it together. And Rose is like, no, I'm good. Kind of seeing somebody. Met him on Facebook. I'm not really feeling Rufus right that. And the owner's like, I wasn't asking you. I was telling you. Oh, there's a cabin here for you. I'm going to send you all in there. And if I don't have a child, there's going to be a problem. Right? So eventually Rufus is like, man, what we got to do. Right? Rose is like, no. At one point, Rose hits him in the head with a metal pipe, I believe it was. Right? She was serious about defending her body against what she saw as an incursion upon that body, whether it was her owner trying to do with her or whether it was another slave. It didn't matter. Right? Now, this is interesting behavior because she's supposed to be property. She's not supposed to disagree with what her owner says at all. Right? She's not even really supposed to have her own opinion. What this shows you is that, of course, slaves weren't just property. They weren't, beasts of burden. They were people, and they often decided to resist in whatever way possible. Now, this is an important question. It's a question that actually troubled historians for a while. Right? This question of slave resistance. Right? This question of slave resistance. Text talks about it a bit. The movie talked about it a bit indirectly. This question of resistance troubled historians for a while. What do I mean? I'll give you a statistic and show you how it troubled historians for a long time. About 80% of runaway slaves were young single men, no kids. About 80% of runaway slaves were young single men with no kids. Okay, so what? Well, the so what, part of the so what is, historians in studying slavery looked at this statistic and said, oh, if slaves resisted, then it was the men that resisted. Right? Which must mean maybe slavery wasn't so bad for women. Maybe they weren't so upset with it. Right? The men are the ones running away. Right? There's a gender kind of analysis that was brought to this, and it's a mistaken analysis by historians. Professional historians, this would be their belief for quite a while. Right? Well, 80% of them males are running away, so men must have resisted more than women. Now, how might we understand this statistic that 80% of runaways were young men? What do you think might be the reality of that statistic?
Obviously, the women, in order to run away, they would have to take the kids with them, and that could be dangerous.
Okay, so women would have to take
Or
the
they
kids
were
with them.
pregnant.
Or they might be pregnant, right? Which would make it extremely. I can't even walk fast when I got a stomach ache. I can't imagine trying to run anywhere, 1,000 miles or so, with a person inside you. Look at that. You can see logistically why that might be problematic. You had something similar?
Another part that might make it really hard to analyze this part of history is you can only analyze what's reported, and I don't see a lot of slave owners, especially if they catch runaways in their within their land trying to escape. I don't really see them reporting that, just trying to deal with it as quietly as possible.
Informal ways of dealing with things. And your first point is a really important one too. It's hard to analyze things you don't have a source for, right? The source for what are they going to be the slave? Why'd you run away? Well, I was being mistreated. Blah, blah, blah. No, you're a slave. You have no opinion. So yeah, the source is going to be skewed quite often towards those that are in power.
Adding to what you said, maybe only the men were reported because they were probably punished. As for the women, they didn't want to punish themselves because they saw them as a breeding ground.
This is an important point too, because it's complicated. That's at least partially correct. Now, Frederick Douglass tells a story. I'll get too bad. I won't stay here too long because it's not a good subject. Frederick Douglass told the story. One of the parts of his classic autobiography was all the violence he saw as a child, even. And so he talks about an enslaved pregnant woman that had run away or done something, being told to lay on the ground. They dug a hole, and she lay on the ground with her stomach in the hole so that they could whip her and not damage the property, not kill the kid, basically. So sometimes they made exceptions, but you're right. There might be different types of punishments. It might be more lenient, it may or may not. But again, think about how that's going to perhaps skew our vision of it. Now, think about the other side of this argument. Does that mean that men didn't care about their children? Because that's going to be one of the stereotypes coming out of this institution, right? Well, slave men obviously didn't care about their kids. They'd run away and leave them. No, that's not accurate either. Well, most fathers lived on different plantations from their children. So that might change things. But most of the runaways were young men without children. So they might have less of a community to run from. Maybe they have less ties, right? I was making a joke earlier, but I think you'll understand the joke. In my morning class, I was talking about I have 2 kids. And if we even want to go to the drive-thru at McDonald's, it's a whole process, right? Tell my son, hey, go brush your teeth, right? Okay, put something in your hair real quick, right? Some lotion on. You can't wear those shoes. No, you can't go outside with just your underwear on. Put some clothes on, right? This and that. 16-month-old girl, like, okay, come on, Harriet, let's go get in your car seat. She immediately runs away. Right? You can't catch me. Grabs her cup of milk, probably turns it over. I'm like, oh man, I got to clean this up. Okay, we just want to go through the drive-thru. It might take an hour to get out of the house. Right? Now imagine I'm trying to run away with her, right? We're in the forest or the swamps. We're going, shh, the dogs are coming. She's hilarious, right? But as soon as I tell her, shh, she likes to yell. We would be caught in about 10 feet. It would take about 10 feet. I wouldn't get from here to downtown Walnut before I'd be caught. So folks made this calculation. Am I going to actually be able to escape? That doesn't mean they were happy with the institution, as you saw in the video, right? Just because may have been singing while they worked doesn't necessarily mean that they were happy working as slaves, right? We're going to see a number of things happening. But it also doesn't mean that women resisted less than men. Right? There are going to be more records of men in leading slave revolts, for instance, or physically fighting masters. Frederick Douglass, in fact, will fight one of his masters and kind of beat him up. And he decides when he learned how to read and when he picked this guy up that he was no longer a slave. Even before he escaped, he's like, nah, my head was already in freedom. can identify that with notions of manhood, but be careful because that's not the only way to resist. In fact, usually that way to resist gets you killed. Right? So a lot of folks are going to resist in other ways. In particular, women. So let me give you 3 quick examples of what I mean in terms of this gendered resistance. This first way that many would resist, abstinence. Many women decide not to have children and not to reproduce slaves. Say, you know what? This life is horrible. I'm going to make sure I don't have any children born into it. That means I don't have sexual relationships. Doesn't mean I don't have children. Whatever it is. Now, how can that be resistance? Well, because they're deciding not to reproduce a system that requires them to reproduce. You technically can't bring in any more slaves. Now, again, they did smuggle some in, but the numbers go down dramatically, right? It has to come from reproduction. So this question of abstinence, you can definitely argue, is resistance. And it's resistance by women. Right? This is a gendered form of resistance. It's pretty radical to choose to alter your life in that way to undermine the institution, right? That you as an individual can slow down the growth of this institution. I think that's pretty radical. Now, what some say is an even more radical form, an even rarer form that some women chose was abortion. Some slave women chose abortion as well. And your point about the sources is a good one here. Read these sources from slave owners that are saying, man, or letters to friends, man, I just don't get it. I have 20 women on my plantation of childbearing age. On average, the slave women of this county have children once every 2 years. Once every 2 years, you expect them to be pregnant with a child. But he's like, but for some reason on my plantation, there hasn't been a child born in 20 years. I have the worst luck of all time. Because I have 20 women, and they each have, let's say, 10 kids, that's a whole lot of money. Slaves were expensive property by this point. One historian said they were the most expensive form of property besides the land itself. So for them not to have any children could bankrupt you. I have the worst luck. Now come to find out that there was some imagined community going on many of these plantations, especially among older women and younger women. Older women pulls the younger lady aside, hey, come here. Let's go for a walk. They go out to the woods. You see that root out there, that plant? Yeah, I see it, that old honeysuckle or whatever. If you pick that, grind it up in a little tea, and drink it, you won't get pregnant. Really. Or if you mix that one and that one, if you are pregnant and you drink it, you will no longer be. Oh. Don't tell master. Is that resistance, do you think? Could be dramatic resistance, especially from the perspective of that master, right? Who might go broke. Again, I'm not saying that that's the right choice. I'm not saying it's the only choice. It's going to be a difficult choice for many, especially if they feel like their only option might be to try to have a family, to try to have a normal life. Some folks will decide to go a different direction. And this will be obviously much more of a radical decision in the minds of some than just not getting pregnant to begin with, right? Because it's ending pregnancy once it begins. But some will do so, and some will do so. And this is the women's resistance option. A woman's resistance option. It's not going to show up in statistics, but also may skew that whole 80% male runaway thing. All men resisted, all women didn't, right? It's not true, not true. Now there's another form, one more that was seen as the most radical. Let's see if you can help me figure out why. Infanticide. Now you can kind of look at that term and figure out what it means. What do you think infanticide means? Killing a child, killing an infant once it's already born, once it's already here. Now this would be rare, extremely rare. Think about the motherly instinct that would have to be overcome and all of that, but there are examples of this. The most famous example is probably a woman named Margaret Garner. 1857, Margaret Garner and her family run away. They're running, trying to get to the north. I believe they are about to cross the Ohio, or just across the Ohio River in the 1850s when the slave traders catch up to them. They're about to be recaptured. Margaret Garner, it's her husband, I think 2 kids. Right before they're about to be captured and returned back to slavery, Margaret Garner grabs her child, cuts the child's throat. She's trying to cut the other one's throat before they grab her. What's wrong with you? You crazy? Have you lost your mind? She's going to be tried for murder, of course, and they ask her, did you go crazy? Temporary insanity? She's like, no. Her quote was something like, I was just as cool as I am now. I didn't want my children to live lives as slaves, especially my daughters. Especially my daughters. Now, why may she have made that particular gender distinction? You can make some guesses. Her fear of rape for herself and her children. Maybe she had something she'd experienced as an enslaved woman. She decides better for them to be dead. Now, again, even within the slave community, this would be seen as extremely radical. Many would have shunned her for this or criticized her for this, but she decided that that's the route she wanted to go. So, again, for historians, for maybe 100 years to say women didn't resist, that slavery was good for them, you can see why that now seems ridiculous. But why we have to be careful, especially in the types of sources we consider accurate. And when we don't have enough sources, sometimes we got to read between the lines of certain things. Now, again, that case happens in the 1850s, which is why I want to kind of set this context of what's going on in the 1850s, especially leading up to war, as the nation is dividing itself, as the nation seems to be moving in different directions. But we also want to inject this slave perspective, right? These are people whose names we may not know, but their stories are significant. They tell you a story about resistance. They tell you a story about the significance of freedom, right? We were talking about the significance of freedom for the American revolutionaries. I would say that freedom was just as important for them, even if they weren't always able to achieve it. You can see that it was important to them based on some of the things that they're going to do or try to do in this period. There are 3 major slave revolts that are often pointed to in this period. In 1800, Gabriel Prosser plans a revolt. In 1822, Denmark Vesey plans a revolt in South Carolina. It's about to go off, and then the storm comes. They have to postpone it, and somebody tells on them, so they get in trouble. So think about notions of imagined community, right? Not everyone in your community is on your side. That's good advice even today. Somebody snitches on it, basically. 1831, Nat Turner's rebellion is the biggest in American history. Nat Turner and his followers would kill about 60 Southern whites before they were captured and executed. So folks knew that resistance was real, and we're going to start to see some responses, including some of the stereotypes you saw outlined in the ethnic notions. Right? Think about this notion. Slaves are happy. They're happy. They're dancing. They don't want to be free. Right? Those stereotypes were being created at the exact moment that Nat Turner's running around cutting folks' throats. So even though it may have seemed like you were just watching cartoons, right, think about the political significance of this. Think about what was being done with those images. Right? Those images were almost soothing, right? Calming for pro-slavery Southerners at the time to make them feel okay about the institution. It's one of the things about human beings, right? We often do things we know is wrong, but we often try to justify what we're doing. I think we have to do that sometimes to understand and to make it right in our own minds. So think about the context, but also think about some of the other challenges. Think about how the sources themselves may not always tell the full story. One last example about sources and this resistance, and then we'll get back to this. I may have told you this already. In certain plantation owners' records and diaries and letters to friends, they also talk about how dumb their slaves are. It's just stupid. They're like children. They're just really idiots. It's a good thing they're enslaved because they couldn't take care of themselves, right? For example, I got these brand new shovels. And told me, tomorrow's going to be a big day. I need about 16 hours from you. Yes, it's going to be really hot, but I need you to get this whole field of cotton taken care of tomorrow, Sekani, right? And me as a slave, it's a funny picture. I can't even work after lunch, right? But imagine they're like, Sekani, I need you to put in 16 hours today. It's going to be over 100 degrees, but I need you to go ahead and get it done. I'm like, okay, boss, no problem. I'll tell you what, I'm going to go to sleep early so I can work really hard for you tomorrow. Okay, that sounds good. Don't you do that? So I get up early. I'm like, you got the new shovels, boss? So yeah, here you go. I take the shovel out and start immediately. Shovel breaks. Boss, where did you get these shovels at? Did you get these from Walmart? Tell you what, I was so ready to, I had stretched and everything, I had a good breakfast, I was ready to work. You don't understand how much cotton I was going to pick today. But this shovel is just snapped. I'm so sorry, I'm stupid. I don't know what to do. I don't know what happened. Maybe I did it wrong. I don't think maybe you could. Tell you what, you take this back, you still have your receipt? You take it back to the Walmart in town, okay? It's 3 hours away. Tell you what, I'm going to sit here under this shade tree. I'm going to drink a little lemonade. You take it 3 hours back into town, exchange it, take it the 3 hours back, and as soon as you get back, I'm going to pick so much cotton you won't believe it. I'll be here under the shade tree. It's a little cool over here, okay? I'll be right. You wake me. Tell you what, wake me up when you get back, okay? Okay. Now what has just happened? I found a way to get out of at least 6.5 hours of work, right? Now, if I do this too often or too blatantly, or if I'm not convincing, I might get whipped. But if not, I save myself a lot of work. What's the slave owner's diary going to say? Connie is such an idiot. He don't even know how to use a shovel. Sorry, boss. So think about this question of resistance, these everyday forms, right? These everyday forms. I know that if I kill the master, I'm going to be executed. But I know that if I break a shovel, I can get out of a day's work. There are stories about women feigning pregnancy. Now, this works especially because we as men know very little about the female anatomy. Right? We're clueless. If y'all are too complicated, I don't know. So imagine, a woman comes to her owner and says, "Hey, boss, you'll be so happy. I'm pregnant. I think it's twins. It might be. Imagine that, two big old boys. Whoa." I tell you what, I hope it works out. Right? I'm gonna take it a little easy. No, you know what? I'm not. I'm gonna go pick. How much? 16 hours today. Let's go. Give me a shovel. Boss like, wait. Let's make sure those kids come out good. I was thinking, ching, right? Tell you what, for the next 9 months, I want you to do a half day. You sure, boss? Because I want to work for you. Now you take it easy. Do a half day. I don't want any issues. Okay, if you insist. I'm going to go put my feet up, right? 6 months later. How you feeling? Feeling good. You're not really showing yet. Oh, no, we don't show in my family. Don't worry about it. 9 months later, pretty soon, coming soon. I can feel it. Any day now, right? 10 months later, boss was like, hey, go examine her. Make sure she's telling me the truth. Right? Send an older lady in there. Oh, yeah, she's pregnant. 12 months later, boss is like, now at this point, she gets whipped. But what has she just done? It's only a year worth of work. Right? So think about this question of resistance and how we might define it broadly. This is just some of the stories that come out of this sort of antebellum era of slavery, this antebellum period. Okay, so slavery and expansion are going to be important, and ultimately they're going to be at the center of what tears the nation apart, literally. We outlaw the slave trade just as England had done the year before, right? We outlawed January 1, 1808. And rather than solving the problem, I think it only increases the issues. It only increases the sectional tensions. Right? Only the sectional tensions increase in this period. Every time a new state comes up for statehood, for instance, the question again comes up, is it going to be a slave state or a free state? Is it going to be a slave state or a free state? The economics play into this quite a bit. By 1860, cotton accounts for almost 60% of American exports. 60% or $200 million a year in the current money. And I told you by the time the Civil War comes, we're producing 75% of the cotton for the entire planet, not just for us or for England, but for the entire planet. The population, I gave you some numbers on that already, will increase. From 1790, there are 700,000 slaves, to 1860, there are 4 million slaves and 500,000 free blacks. So the population will increase despite these forms of resistance and others. By 1850, more than half of all slaves are engaged in cotton growing. 20% are growing other crops, like tobacco, 10%, but also rice, sugar, hemp is an important product, not just for smoking, but for clothing. Some slaves are domestic slaves, meaning they work in the home. You could work in mining, you could work at the docks, depending on the city especially. They might find them in different jobs, but for the most part, they're going to be field hands engaged in cotton production. At the same time, they are resisting. More than 1,000 a year will run away. And we mentioned that the three biggest slave revolts of the 19th century: Gabriel Prosser, Denmark Vesey, and Nat Turner. This leads to tremendous fear, right? Tremendous hostility. Pro-slavery Southerners start to feel like they're under attack, right? They literally feel like they're under attack on their own plantations from their slaves, but they also feel like they're under attack from outsiders, from abolitionists, right? And this is part of the conversation you saw reflected in the film. Right? The abolitionist movement by the 1830s is becoming more and more radical, as we laid out, and you start to see the creation of pro-slavery arguments, or the modification of pro-slavery arguments. What's the best way to defend yourself against the charge that you're a rapist, that you're taking advantage of people that don't want to be enslaved? Well, counter that with, well, they're not unhappy, they're singing. Right? They love to serve. This is their natural role, right? They're sambos, they're coons, they're mammies, all of that. So these stereotypes are created at a certain moment. Why is it they're created in the 1830s and not the 1630s? Because you didn't need them in the 1630s. You needed them now. At the same time, the nation is growing, like literally growing, geographically growing. In 1800, there are 16 states. In 1850, there are 31 states. So in terms of the number of states, bless you, we're growing. The nation triples in size. The population is increasing. In 1800, there are about 5.3 million Americans. In 1800. By 1850, there are 23 million Americans, more than 4 times the number in a 50-year period. The 1850s are then kind of announcing us as a power in many ways. Right? I think we start to have a certain pride about American culture being, at least approaching being the equal of England. Right? We used to look up to England for everything. Its writers, its painters, its artists were seen as, the top, and these Americans were always seen as kind of second rate. But think about some of the culture coming out of the 1850s, some of the writers that we're still familiar with from this period. For example, an American Renaissance with writers like Henry David Thoreau, or Emily Dickinson, Walt Whitman, Herman Melville, right? We can produce our own art. We can produce our own writing and literature that's worthy, right? Hawthorne, the Scarlet Letter, social criticism in their writing, right? Something like the Scarlet Letter, or Frederick Douglass's slave narrative, right? He not only writes his story, but it's going to become an abolitionist text. People read this and they're like, man, slavery's horrible. We should get rid of it. So these images, cultural images, social images, are not just images, they're political. That's one of the points of the video, right? That they're not just images, that they do political work. They're doing political work. Harriet Beecher Stowe is often held up as the quintessential example of writing that is political. Right? Harriet Beecher Stowe is a white abolitionist woman from the North, and she, in response to the Fugitive Slave Act that we'll talk about in a second, in response to this law that she sees as particularly troublesome, she writes a book. She writes a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin paints a horrible picture of slavery and how slaves are mistreated and such. Many Southerners are offended by it, and her book goes viral. It sells 300,000 copies the first year, 2 million copies by the time the Civil War comes. Right. When Abraham Lincoln meets Harriet Beecher Stowe, he says, I want to meet the woman that started the Civil War. Some feel that this text is that important. Right? It kind of pits North against South in tensions that are already developing, these already developing sectional tensions. How can a book start a war? Well, because its topic was seen as so political in an already political moment. So the 1840s, 1850s, this period leading up to the war during the antebellum period is really, really important. We're already seeing, I think, the regions separate, develop differently. They're starting to look at each other as if they're not a part of the same nation, as if they have different interests, different goals. And you're literally seeing a split. Now, they had always managed the split before. Remember the compromises we've talked about, right? Before 1840, compromise had always won out. But now people are starting to question whether disunion is possible. Right? Disunion might be possible. Disagreements over slavery had already split a number of religious denominations. Right? Certain religious denominations had split in this period. The Presbyterians split in 1837, the Methodists split in 1844, the Baptists split into Northern and Southern in 1845. So you're literally seeing folks split over this idea in part. Notions of states' rights, right, especially in the South, like Congressman John C. Calhoun, right, putting forth the idea that states had certain rights, and that the South in particular could protect these legitimate sort of minority rights in a democratic system. And that limiting slavery would be a limit on their freedom. Now, Northerners are afraid that these Southerners, especially these large Southern slaveholders, are too powerful, that they constitute what they call the slave power or slaveocracy, that they were so powerful they could dominate the government. They were the wealthiest people in the country, and they perhaps could be the political dominant force as well, if they were allowed to grow and expand. Both groups, North and South, abolitionists and pro-slavery, feel like expansion is important to them and to the nation as a whole. So we already kind of have a battlefield in the West that North and South are competing over. Many of the Northern Whigs that had opposed the Mexican-American War did so for anti-slavery reasons, but they still considered expansion to be key. And I think it's interesting that both sides feel like, they have a right to kind of determine their destiny in this sense, and that the other side kind of wants to destroy them. That the other side does not have their best interests at heart. This is becoming such a divisive issue that we will see a gag rule instituted. What is the gag rule? The gag rule said, the one in 1844, prohibited petitions against slavery from being read or discussed in Congress. That it was too divisive an issue. We can't even let you introduce this idea because it's too divisive. We will literally see congressmen fighting each other in Congress in this period. One congressman, Preston Brooks, will beat another congressman from Massachusetts over the head with his cane and knock him unconscious in Congress. People are bringing knives and guns to Congress by this point. Civil war is seeming more likely. Long story short. Some say by 1850, Northerners and Southerners had effectively created different communities. Maybe they've created different communities. Northerners considered the South economically backward, that this was an outdated system of slavery, not a modern industrial system. And Southerners considered Northerners to be hypocrites, that they were benefiting from slavery too. They just wanted to act like they had no connection to it. Many Northern factory workers are, when they feel oppressed, calling themselves wage slaves. That term wage slave becomes a thing. So in many ways, we already have the stage set, right? We already have the kind of stage set here, and that's part of what I want to do. I want to take a snapshot here in a second of the era of the Civil War and see where we were and where we're going to go from there. Right? Where we were.